Hello, everyone. I'm North Hempstead Town Supervisor Judy Bosworth. The Town Board and I are proud to present a very special At Home with North Hempstead program, celebrating the life and legacy of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., one of the most influential leaders of the 20th century. The role he played in the American Civil Rights Movement would forever change the face of history and alter the direction of this country. It's extraordinarily important that we follow the path that Dr. King paved for us. We must all find the courage to stand up and fight for human equality, dignity, and justice for all. While so much has been done, there is still much work left to do.
My name is Bernice Sims, and I live in Mineola, New York. Well, I grew up in a place called Meridian, Mississippi, that ended up being, for the most part, the epicenter of the civil rights movement. My involvement started when I was probably between 14 and 15 years old. I was a member of the NAACP. I was actually recruited from the church. That's how many of the civil rights movement, they have a history in the black churches. And I was recruited. I didn't really know exactly what was in store for me, but there was a plan, there was a master plan with a particular group of youth that they had really just found out, did a little research on me, and some of my other compadres, I would like to say, my group. We were, for the most part, good students. For the most part, we were very much, we enjoyed government a lot and politics. And I think they discovered that by us very early. We enjoyed those kind of things, and we were challenged by those kinds of things in our school. And we were also brought up, of course, in the South, and my family to be Christians, and I attended Sunday school and church and all of those kinds of things. This was important for my religious and spiritual upbringing. And I was recruited by actually an assistant to Medgar Evers. He was a photographer, but what he did, he took school pictures and rings. That was a part of his job. That's what I knew him to do. But I discovered later that he had because he did visit many schools with the rings and the pictures, he was able to, he was a member of the NAACP, and he was able to try to impress upon the communities that he visited the importance of advancement in the NAACP. And he ended up being, actually, as I say, Medgar Evers, who was slain in 1963. He was his assistant. So we attended groups together to learn about nonviolence. Of course, we heard about the work of Dr. Martin Luther King, and it was understood that we would be involved in protest marches and silent, sometimes sing-ins we did, and silent protest marches. It would usually be after church or on the weekends. And we understood that we were doing it because it had been discovered that in our hometown, African American people were disenfranchised. They were not able to get work in places in public service. For instance, we had electricity, but there was no one of color working for the electric companies or the telephone companies or the gas companies. So we understood our role was we were protesting these particular kind of social injustices, and that appealed to us as teenage activists who were very patriotic, who was brought up to believe that, everything that we had learned in school and all the pledges that we had made, we pledged allegiance to the flag every morning. We sang the songs, and we learned the praises and the phrases of the thing that made this country great. We learned poems like America for Me by Henry Van Dyke, that he talks about how great it is to live in Venus, and it's great to study Rome, but when it comes to living, there's no place like home. There's no place like America for me. And we really ingested all of those things. We learned about in our school how a bill became a law. we learned and we were very much moved by the three systems working together in concert, how there was this check and balance system between the executive branch and the judicial branch and the legislative branch. And we thought it couldn't be a more perfect union, and we loved our country and America for me, and the song, when we learned about the Star Spangled Banner and Francis Scott Key, how he wrote that under the conditions of the War of 1812 and bomb bursting in air. He didn't know whether or not there were bombs. He didn't know whether or not he was going to survive that. And it became even more important. So all of this patriotism played a part in our activism, as well as the fact that, as you know, adolescents are, they think they're omnipotent. Nothing could really happen to them. So as we heard about the sit-ins and the students that was in Greenboro who was beaten for protesting and trying to be served at lunch counters, somehow that didn't frighten us because we felt as though we were doing something that we were entitled to as American citizens, and we didn't think that anything was wrong with us, but we thought it was something wrong with the system that was in place and what we could do if we had a voice, if we could vote, if we could protest, then this is something that we could do about our situation to provide some dignity for the injustices. So the idea of getting involved in voter registration and registering people to vote and having that voice was very important to us as kids. And we thought we were fighting for something much bigger than we were. And it didn't matter that we were rejected and we ran into obstacles and conflicts. We just knocked on one door closed, we'd go to another. So that's how we were, I guess that was our patriotic brainwashing, of adolescents who felt that there was a need for to fight for what we thought was inherently ours. And by the Constitution, all men are created equal. So that's kind of how they got me involved. I was brought up in a home, I was kind of surrounded by brothers who, I think because there was a long time before there was a girl in the family, I think they kind of received me, my siblings were my brothers, so they received me well. And they trained me to do many things that they did. I was one of these kids that would climb trees and jump over tributaries of little water, lakes, and whatever they would do, I was just so encouraged by that, and I didn't feel as though there should have been any limitations because I was a girl. It was maybe years later that I realized that there was rules for girls and rules for boys. But I think it kind of started with that. I was kind of a tomboy, but a prissy tomboy. I climbed the trees with them, but I wasn't wearing pants. I wore skirts. So I would take my long skirt and bring it up between my legs and get a belt and make I guess it was kind of like the dancer, what's his name? Hammer pants. And now that I think about it, and I would climb trees and jump over everything, just the same as they did. And because they encouraged me and they thought I was tough, they enjoyed that. We're going to toughen her up. We have to get her prepared for the world ahead. So I think it was part of my position in the family with the boys, surrounded by one younger and two older. Actually, two of them three of us worked together in the civil rights movement. But because of that special kind of place that I had in so many ways, when I noticed, I would go back to, I think I was about 6 years old. When we moved from one area to the other, we kind of lived out in what would be considered the suburb of a Meridian, but we moved to town, which I found out later is only 4 miles away. I thought it was like a long ways away, but it was 4 miles from the country to town. And we would go shopping, and that's when I began to notice that I saw Black people, when someone white was coming, the understanding that to approach them, they had to move to the side of the street. And I began to notice that. And then I noticed that the water fountains, that was the thing. There was one for colored, written colored, and there was one for white. But I noticed the architecture of the water fountains. The one for colored was like a little small basin, and for the most part, the water ran, the water was not freely flowing from that particular one. And I looked on the inside, and it would look rusted. It was kind of rust. But just immediately next to it was this rectangular shape, gray-looking machine that made this roaring, monotonous sound. And I noticed that the water was flowing freely. And I looked at that, and I saw white. And then my mother said, "You're supposed to drink from this one." And I looked at it, and when my head was turned, I drank from the one that said colored, but the water was warm. It wasn't cool and refreshing. And I saw this tank with this water in it. Some of it dripped on me while I was at the lower one, and it was cool. So I turned and I drank from it. And it was cool and it was refreshing. And I said, in my mind, I said, who would do this? Who would do this? Who would do this? They were right next to each other. So, of course, every chance I got, I was told not to drink from it. I always did. Because it was, the water was more refreshing. And I think early on, I started asking my mother questions about that. But who would make something like this? It was the architecture that really, the observer of that really bothered me. And I felt that it was insulting. I couldn't come up with the words, but I felt it was insulting. And my mother, in her own way, would try to explain to me, well, there are rules that we are living under, Jim Crow law. I don't particularly like it either, but these are the things that we're supposed to do. And I was thinking, but why? Why? If, the song that I learned in church, red and yellow, black and white, we are precious in His sight. I was brought up, in other words, it conflicted with my religious upbringing too, because God loves everybody. This is God's world. This is my world too. And so for me to be treated differently or rejected, it didn't make sense. It didn't make sense for the child that I was brought up to be as a religious child. And I said, well, God doesn't make any mistakes. There's something wrong somewhere else. It's not God. It's not my family teaching. It's something else. There's something else that I couldn't put my finger on it, but I knew it. And I felt very bad about it, and I felt the feeling that I had when I saw the different signs, it was like an insult. It was an assault, and it was an insult. When I went to she took us to the train station, and here's my mother trying to protect us, and at the same token, give us something that the world had to offer. I found the train stations, and to this day, I find the trains depot one of the most comforting places to be, because my mother used to take us there, and we always brought sandwiches and brought food from home. And we went in the section, it was the colored section, and we would sit there and we would have our sandwiches downtown. And I would hear the trains coming in, and no one knew that we were not waiting for someone, and to hear the trains come in and leave. It was very comforting, and she wanted us to be able to sit down and eat, but none of the restaurants would serve us. And it was that, and I discovered that the bathrooms, there was a white bathroom and there was a colored. And there was another thing that I noticed. I was about 13 or 14 when I got on the bus, and there was a demarcation line, a white line that said, white sit up front, black sit behind that line. And at that time, I know, and it was about 54, 55, I'd heard about the person called the mother of the civil rights movement, Rosa Parks, had done. Evidently, I must have heard about that. One day I was going to a job. I had a little Saturday job across town, and I used to do work for this Caucasian woman, and on Saturdays iron. I was never a good ironer. I couldn't iron very well, but I was hired to do it. And so I had to ride this bus. It was a long ride from home. And I decided one day that, I said, I've been working, and I said, I'm just not gonna sit on the back of the bus. And I wonder what would happen. So with tremendous fear and trepidation, I got on the bus and I sat in front of the line of the bus. I was doing my own desegregating the bus line in Meridian at 14. And I sat there, and for a few moments, the bus driver didn't say anything. He looked towards the back because the other black patrons were now getting very uneasy, and they were moving around and shifting. And the white patrons were shifting, and they were looking at the bus driver to say something. It was the longest silence that you can imagine. And so after a while, the bus driver looked back to the black people sitting in the back, they're the ones supposed to put me in check. I guess the understanding was. And so it just so happened that my aunt was on the bus, and she started talking to me. And I stayed stiff as a board. I didn't look back. I didn't listen to her at all. It was something that I had to do. I felt as though my dignity was at stake. So I sat there, and after a while, after she couldn't coerce me to move, the bus driver started talking, said, Gal, we call Gal, you better go on back there. You better listen to your whomever. And I just sat there, and I just said, I don't know what's going to happen, but I cannot move. And actually, I reached a point where I couldn't move. I could not move. I was perspiring. I was anxious. I was afraid. I had tremendous fear. But it was something that I felt like I must do. It was the day I had to do it. And so eventually, I got to my stop, and I got off. And I got much cajoling from the black people on the bus, as well as the bus driver. And when I got off the bus, I was relieved. And I just thought, when I got off, there's going to be somebody waiting here to arrest me. I was prepared to be arrested and be taken to jail, beaten, anything. But I know that I had to make that move that day. I had to see what it felt like to exert my freedom. I can't explain it any other way than that. I can't tell you what was going on other than that I look back. What stiffened me, at one point I started to get up to go one seat back. I think I did, and then I went back to the seat, and I just was unable to move. It was a stand that I had to take. I grew up in Jim Crow South. There was all the signs, all the restaurants we couldn't go to, no places we couldn't stay, no hotels. Movie theaters were segregated. We had one theater called the Star Theater that was where the blacks could attend. At one point, there was another theater that blacks and whites could attend. I think it was called the Temple Theater, I believe. Name might not be exactly correct because it changed names. But the blacks were to sit upstairs and the whites were to sit downstairs. And I wouldn't go because the first thing I thought about, what if a fire breaks out, Then I'm gonna have a hard time, getting out. That's a dangerous situation for me. So I didn't really participate in the integrated movie theater. And we went to the segregated movie theater. So it was all there, all the signs were there. But every time I saw them, I just felt insulted, and I felt a personal assault. Even as early as 6 years old, I remember that. In my particular group of activists, it was probably only about 12 of us, 12 to 14, and all didn't stay. We were criticized. We were laughed at and made fun of by our classmates. There was a group that were activists, and there was a group that just accepted things the way they were. You're absolutely right. I don't know what made some people different. There were some that were different and didn't accept, and they resisted. Many of us, we read about what was going on in the world, We were aware of what our government was supposed to do and offer us as citizens. We believed in the, as I said, the Declaration of Independence. We believed in all those things. We were criticized. There was a situation where one of the martyrs that was killed, James Chaney, who I write about in my book, who's my next door neighbor, he was arrested for wearing it was a paper NAACP button badge on his clothing to school. He was actually he was suspended from school by the black principal because at the time we called him different names, but I guess in many ways he didn't want to lose funding and he didn't want any problems. So many of the things people did as a form of, I guess they thought they were protecting us in the black community. But there were a number of activists in the black community. There was a lot of support that we received in the South from the white community, from some of the churches, from the Jewish community, but they couldn't do it publicly. But we received a lot of support. There was financial support. There was all kinds of social support, but it was not known. They couldn't not let that be visible. So some of us that were working in the movement knew we were supported. We had support from a number of systems, and I think that gave us also the encouragement to continue to go on. Yeah. Well, as I said, in the church, from the churches, we would leave. We marched. We went to other communities where there are other activists like us. One was Jackson, Mississippi. It was about 93 miles away. That's when I spent time. I remember very clearly, it was in the spring. I spent time in the home of Medgar Evers, the slain leader who was slain in front of his house. Prior to that, we had been, as I mentioned before, we had been marching, and we had our picket sign. We picket places of employment, schools. We picketed. There was a center there. There was a community center that had a swimming pool and a park. We weren't able to go to the parks. We picketed those. We would many times silent protest because we were peaceful. We had our signs. And there were other things that we did as testers. We went to some of the white churches. We would dress up in our finest on Sunday morning and go to some of the churches and to see if we would be received, because church, after all, is supposed to receive everyone. And we were treated basically with benign neglect. We were ignored, and then afterwards, I remember one minister in particular came and said, he told us a story about the red birds and the black birds. And he said, if God had intended them to be together, he wouldn't have made black birds and red birds. And he intended for us to be separate. He came up after church, and that was his lecture to us about what we were trying to do. No one did anything violent towards us in the church, but they just totally ignored us as though we weren't even there. We did testing, things like that. We also went to, as couples, to some of the hospitals that would not receive us because the hospitals were colored, had a colored section, a white section. Went with some of the civil rights workers as they began to come down, and we tried to apply for, whatever services or whatever, and we were rejected. We went to lunch counters, tried to get service. We were rejected. There was a case where there was one in particular, we called it, we had a name for it, that we talked about. It was a Saturday, protest day. We decided to, protest the stores that wouldn't hire. They were the 5 and 10s. They don't have them now. Things like Crest and Woolworths. I don't know if you ever heard of those stores, Crest and Woolworths. We would go and we would stop, had signs up, and we were encouraging the people to stop buying. And we would try to counter people, African American people, to going into the stores. If you get hired, then you don't buy there. We participate in those kinds of things, early protest marches and resistance. The other piece, we traveled to other communities. When I went to the home of Medgar Evers, we went to his church. And that's when I really started hearing about the civil rights workers, that they were going to be coming. And the big piece was the voter registration. We understood that was very important to get people registered to vote. And that's when I first heard about the Freedom Summer at his church. And I went back to his home and we had lunch. And it was actually, because his piece had been employment, and we were in front of the stores and the businesses trying to get people hired. That was a big piece of his early work, was in employment, equal employment. It wasn't long after that I found out, years later, that he was murdered on June 12th, 1963. By then I was a little old, I was older. By then I think I must have been between 15 and 16. And I had been in this home and I was thinking about, I was so near his garage. He was gunned down in front of his garage as he had come home from a meeting. And one of the things that I later found out was that he would ask his children and his family, because he knew that he was under attack and there had been many threats against his life. He asked his family, where would you go? Let's come up with a place in the house that would be the safest place to go. And they all decided the bathroom and the bathtub. And I remembered, when I read that, I remembered that I had gone in that bathroom and they had sat at the table and made those plans of how they would try to protect themselves. And it wasn't long after that that I had been in his home that he was killed. I only found that out years later as I began to do the research for my book. So one of the things that we did when we did go down to other communities, we would march, protest with the other youth that was involved, and we would go on the streets of downtown Jackson, Mississippi, which was the capital, and we did our protest marches and picketing and businesses or services and things of that nature. So I was kind of involved with that, as well as one of the point that's very important, I think, which I feel very good about, was the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Fannie Lou Hamer in 1964, she at the Democratic National Convention, she and some others tried to unseat the regular Mississippi delegates that was all white. The votes that we went around, we went to homes to get people to register, to just agree to register to vote. Many of them could not write their names. So we were able to get them. Some of them, of course, were afraid and they closed the door in our faces. Some knew we were there. The minister maybe had spoken to them. We went to homes and we got some of the people who could not read and write to write. We were able to put their names down, but they could mark an X. That was a very important. We collected a lot of those X's. That X, that I understood it to mean that if I could vote, if it wasn't for Jim Crow laws and that all of the suppression that was taking place, I would vote. So when the Freedom Summer movement opened up with the Freedom Schools, one of the big pieces of that was the teaching people literacy. And I was involved after school, going to the community center and teaching some of the people to read and write their names. That was a big piece that I was involved with. And we could find those people because we had their address and we had the X, and we knew it. So when we started the program, we went back and we said, okay, we want you to come to the community center and learn literacy, at least well enough to write your names down. So those freedom votes would be authenticated, those votes. So that was something that we were very much involved in. I talk about that in my book, and that was very, very powerful, although Fannie Lou Hamer did not get seated and the other delegates. But it made quite an impact because it was now on the world stage, and they were able to see what took place at the Democratic National Convention in 1964. The significance of the title of my book, Detour Before Midnight, and its Freedom Summer workers, James Chaney, Michael Swerner, and Andrew Goodman, made an unscheduled stop. The unscheduled stop was at my home because they hadn't planned necessarily to come there, to stay as long as they did. They had driven down all night from the training school in Oxford to preparing for working in the civil rights movement and Freedom Summer. James Chaney was a resident there already. He had been involved in the movement, as well as Michael Swerner. I call him Mickey. He had been there about 6 months before. Gotten to know him. I had been involved because I had been involved earlier. Of course, I was a natural recruit. He came to the, Michael Sorner came to the high school to recruit some other students, but they had already pretty much selected us, I and my two brothers. And because we had been involved, they knew about the work we had been involved in voter registration and picketing and, Freedom Summer, the Mississippi voting, trying to get people to register and vote. They knew about our activities. So they came and they were there at my high school, Michael Sorner, and he recruited some other students. And there was probably about 12, I'd say 12 to 14 actively involved. Myself and two of my brothers were part of that group. So I knew Michael Sorner, and I knew, of course, James Chaney was like he was next door neighbor, he was like a brother to me, and I had been involved in working with him before. We'd gone on so-called missions. These missions could represent going to see a minister to talk about opening up the church as a voter registration center, or getting people to register to vote, how they might impact that in the church, speaking. So I had been involved in many of those kinds of things. So, but on this particular day, when they returned we knew that they had gone away and they were returning. About a week before they returned, one of the churches that they had visited in Neshoba County, close to Philadelphia, Mississippi, had been slotted for a community center similar to the one that we had in Meridian, where we were teaching people to register and vote. We had alternative educational opportunities for the black students after school, where they learned a lot about their history and things of that nature, plays and a lot of social activities for them that wasn't available to them normally. They had gone to this site in Neshoba County. They'd been up there before, and it was slotted to be another center of the same kind, pattern on the same one in Meridian. But that week prior to them returning, it was on a Wednesday, a lot of the parishioners of the church were beat up by Klans members because they were looking for Michael Sorner. He had been marked, I found out later, he had been marked for, to be killed by the Klans. And they were looking for them. He wasn't there, so they beat up a lot of church members. Michael Sorner and, of course, James Chaney had heard about that when they came down. They wanted to go up and look at the center because, in addition to that, it had been burned. They wanted to go look at the ruins of this particular site. Also, they wanted to go and check on the people who were beat up in their name for the most part, because they had agreed to have this center there. And so it was two reasons they were going there, to investigate and see how bad the charred remains were and to see the people. They came by my home, and they stated they had driven all night. And what they would do many times, if there was a black person and a white person in the car coming south, they would try to travel at night, because the fact that if you would see a black and white person, it was kind of understood you get in the southern borders, these are the agitators, they're coming to agitate in the south. So they would try to be careful. So they would drive sometime for long hours in the night hours. And they came to my home that morning to get my brother. It was Father's Day. It was June 21st, 1964 was Father's Day. They had come to two reasons: to get my brother to go with them, because of course he had been active in the movement. As I said, three of us were. And they also wanted to bring Andrew Goodman. This was our first time meeting him, first time coming to the South, to meet my family. My family's home was something of a host home. Freedom Summer workers could come down, get a warm meal, a bath, whatever. My mother would, open her home up to them until they found other places to stay. So we were a friendly home, so they would come there. And they brought him there, and they wanted him to meet us, and also to get a haircut. My brothers had the ability they could cut anyone's hair, white, black, they cut everyone's hair. So the white civil rights workers, male and female, couldn't go to the local barbers, first of all, because if they spoke, they would hear the accent, northern accent, and right away they would be ostracized. And many of them, there are stories about many of them have been treated very badly and beaten and other parts of the South and throughout. So because my brothers was in the movement and they could cut hair, it's a perfect place. So they came by that morning and they stated that they had had breakfast. My mother was cooking for the day, because it was Father's Day, it was going to be a long day at church. So, of course, there are foods in the South when you didn't have refrigeration and microwaves and things of that nature that had a long shelf life, and that was usually fried chicken. That's why it was so popular, fried chicken and cupcakes. You could travel with those. And she was making macaroni and cheese. That was Mickey's favorite. He had been in my home many times, had eaten them, and he was very, very close to my mother. I try to bring that out in my book, the very close relationship that they had developed, extremely close. And so he was in the kitchen with her, and they would argue about religion because she didn't understand Jewish. She was a Christian, and she didn't understand how a person could be an agnostic. She thought that meant atheist. And he was Jewish, and for someone who had not accepted Christ, that was a hard thing for her to. So they argued a lot about that in a friendly way. They had those arguments all the time. And it was their bonding time together. We just saw it as we would just kind of leave the room, and they had a lot of fun. So she also was trying to convince them, when she found out where they were going, she was trying to seduce them to sit down to eat because she thought it was not a good time. She'd been hearing on the news about Johnson had signed the Civil Rights Bill, the Act, first of all, the Act, and that there was a lot of resistance going on, and we were beginning to feel that, and she thought it wasn't a good time to go. And she tried to get them to stay longer, but they settled, they acquiesced for just, we'll take a lunch with us. And that was the last thing I was doing, trying to, take them more food, running down the street, chasing the car with a bag to give them more food to take with them. When they came by, we had an exchange with them that was, it was very delightful, and it was fun. And for many, many years, I felt very guilty about that. I didn't tell the story. Every time anyone would hear a story about the 3 civil rights workers, the Mississippi burning, people knew that story. They knew about the Klans and the murder. But no one knew this story about this interaction with this warm family, loving family that they spent time with just a few hours before they lost their life and their freedoms completely. So it was very difficult for me to write the book. I had written notes many years ago. I started doing research as early as '95. There were many obstacles, in the way. Because every time I would read my notes, I was reminded of that day, and it was very sad and very, very painful for me. But I reached a point that I had to get beyond my pain and my guilt and my anger to be able to give a true testimony to these heroic young men who sacrificed their lives for others. That became the motivating factor for me to finally write the book and tell the story. So I spent time with them, quality time with them. My whole family did that day. I wanted to go with them because I had gone on missions with Mickey. I'd ridden around in that station wagon. It was like a staple at my home. My brothers also did the mechanic. They could do mechanical work. They were field workers before with James Chaney. That station wagon was always at my house. They were always there. The freedom workers were always there. And so, I had been with them, and I said, well, since my brother can't go, and the reason my brother couldn't go, because it was Father's Day, and they had a lineup of people to cut their hair. They came early, and they were sitting lined up on my porch. That was at the barber shop waiting room was my porch. And he told him, my brother David said, it was David and Marshall that was involved, myself. They said, well, come back later. I got so many heads to cut. If you could just come back a little later, I could go with you. And so they said, no, we're off schedule. We're off schedule now. And I said, well, I'll go. I volunteer to go in their place, which I had gone before with them. Wouldn't have been anything unusual. And Mickey set me down and he fought with me for a while, and he said, that's not a good place for, I don't think it's a good place for a girl to go, because women weren't wearing pants then, dresses. We're going to be walking over a lot of charred remains of a burnt building, and I don't think it's a place for you to go. He talked me into, he could always get me to change my mind, because he would tell me where I was most needed in the movement. And he said, you're most needed to go down to the office, and man the phones, even on Sunday. So this was great, because this is going to get me out of being at church all day long. I love going down. I was also a secretary, something of a clerical person, with the at the center, at the COFOR office. And he said, you're more needed there. And there was always a plan, and when they wrote out their plans, if they didn't call back by 4 o'clock, we usually, there was a sign that something nefarious had probably taken place, or they had gotten arrested or something. And he told me that, go down and man the phones, you're most needed there. And he talked me out of going with them. But I wanted to go. We'd start getting words in. People were calling around and saying, where was the last place? They were trying to figure out where they were, because, in those days, first of all, you didn't have cell phones and didn't have phones. They wrote their plans down. They had written down plans to go to Neshoba County. They didn't write down that they were coming by the house. They said, we have to go and get our hair cut, and we'll get one of the other workers to go with us. Spent about maybe a little over 2 hours or more in my home. So when it was about 2 days actually. I think it was 2 or 3 days before the FBI, which I didn't recognize as the FBI because they didn't present themselves as the FBI. Some of them misrepresented themselves as news people, because there were some news people. My home was like inundated with news people there, but some FBI was in the mix, and they were trying to find out when they had left my home, and they were able to pretty much pinpoint when they got there. It's only about a 37 miles from my home to Neshoba County where they went. So when they came there and they were looking for them, it was that couple of days that it really began to sink in. But even before that, I just had a feeling in my gut that they didn't come back, because James Chaney was supposed to come back and take his younger brother Ben for ice cream, because he also wanted to go with them, and he had promised to come back, and he didn't come back that same day, that Sunday. And I think instinctively, I knew something was wrong then. I didn't, I'm sure there was fear, however, it was suppressed, because my mind was focused on the work that we were doing at the community center. It was still very much in force. Now all of the Freedom Summer workers had come down. Now you keep in mind, this was June. They were to be there until August. I continued working at the community center. We were involved with the teaching. There was story hours. There was kids there. We worked with them. Reading. There were reading programs. There was literacy programs. We were still, those of us that was older, that was 18, we were still going out in the community, getting people to register to vote, getting those people who had signed the X. We had to continue, because in our head was, this is the work that we started. We had now help with the enforcement was there, the cavalry was there, helping us to do the work that we had been doing all alone. So we just continued to do the work. I remember doing the work, going out, but it was always that pit in my stomach. It was always there, but we continued to do the work, to go on as if we had to complete the task. It was the focus. We didn't, when things really began to sink in, and I began to have a very strong emotional reaction, was within about 5 days, they found the car, the station wagon, the charred remain of the station wagon. And I had come in from working, my volunteer work with the movement, and it was on the news, and we had black and white TV. We didn't have color TV then. I don't know who had. Maybe somebody did, but we did. And I saw this station wagon that I had seen parked in my driveway for so many months. I saw it the scene that I saw, it was being pulled up by a chain. It was being lifted up on television. It was in black and white. And they were talking, and it was news people talking, and then I saw scenes where Michael Swerner's wife had gone to Johnson and was trying to get the FBI more involved in the search for ultimately their bodies. And all because I think it was black and white. It was almost surreal to me. It was though I was looking at a dream. I was looking at something. I began to disconnect it from me emotionally. That's probably the only way I could deal with it. It was black and white. This is a movie. I'm looking at this on TV. And I pretty much put that block up. It began then. And then there were other things that was happening. As I said, we continued the work. We continued to hear about other churches. My church was bombed. There were other churches that was bombed that they had pinpointed as being involved in the civil rights movement and voter registration. We began to hear all about these things happening. I remember also a day, and I knew things are really serious now. We had been planning for a visit from Dr. Martin Luther King. I believe, I'm going to say the date, I believe it was July the 7th or somewhere that first or second week. And we had it in we had a newsletter at the community center at the Freedom Schools. And we were talking about it and planning for that. And he did come down. And I remember, and also there were other activists, James Former of CORE had come down, and I remember them having I remember the white shirts, or they had rolled their sleeves up, and we were marching. We marched in Meridian. We marched in the city. We were hands in hands across the street. I remember that day seeing Dr. Martin Luther King and James Former. And I saw a lot of other people that I didn't realize who they were at the time. There was activists. Congressman Lewis was there. I recognized Reverend, what's his name? Rainbow Coalition. Jesse Jackson. Yeah, Jesse Jackson. He was there. Andrew Young. He trained my brothers. That's why my brothers were trained in Atlanta, Georgia, to be field workers as well, along with James Chaney. Yeah, it was Andrew Young was there, and the Reverend Belver. A number of people was there, and as I said, later on, I was able to put the name with the faces. And, I knew about the work. I had seen Harry Belafonte. I had seen, what's his name? He was another part of Mississippi. The won the Academy Award for Lilies of the Field, Sidney Poitier. And, it was so strange. And I had begun to see them, this group, as they went. This was a little later on, the March on Washington. And I saw all of these activists that were from Hollywood. And I later discovered that and I said, oh, they make movies too? I thought of them as activists because I had seen so many of them. James Garner, Shirley MacLaine, Shelley Winters, Marlon Brando, James Baldwin from, he'd gone to Paris and come back. So I thought of these people as activists. And it was later, oh, they make movies too. Interesting thing, I thought of, most people have an impression of Hugh Hefner, the Playboy magazine, with the girly magazine in the centerfold. When I would hear the name, I connected the name Hugh Hefner with the person, most of the time, a lot of the funds that was put up to get the kids out of jail that got arrested for the civil rights movement was Hugh Hefner. My connection with him, we're going to have to call Hugh Hefner. It was about, for that. And just to tell you where your values are, I thought of him as this is a person we call for the assistant with Dick Gregory and a lot of other activists. So it wasn't so much the Playboy magazine. But as time, as you know, it took, it was 44 days before they discovered their bodies in the earthen grave and not far from a little place in Neshoba County, near Philadelphia, Mississippi. And there was, and the way the announcement was made at the community center, Pete Seeger, we had many folk singers who was involved in the movement, Bobby Dylan, Peter, Paul, and Mary. We used to see them on a regular basis, a lot of the folk singers, Joan Baez. But that particular day, he had a date to come to the community center to do a program, was Pete Seeger. And when they discovered the bodies, he was singing. He was doing a program on stage, and they called him away, and he came out and made the announcements. That's how we found out for sure when they were found. And he had everybody to join hands. And you'll see my siblings and a lot of pictures, and they start singing "We Shall Overcome" with tears and fear. And that's when it really sunk in that, you can get killed doing this. All the things we had been doing, there was no fear, because we felt what we were doing was right and honorable and decent as citizens. And we had help from people who were making tremendous sacrifices, who left their homes. Many of the civil rights workers, they used their own monies, they used their own cars, they had to pay for their own health care to come that far. And the least we can do is, do something for ourselves to better our situation. So the kind of support and the coalition of support that we were receiving, made it impossible not to be involved. I question today sometime, I don't think we had that same kind of coalitions. I think I'm beginning to see some of that, a renewal of that today, but it was very, very clear and very clearly defined what we were doing, and we had a very clear focus. And we had very clear focus, and we had very clear patterns of behavior to operate under. We knew what we were doing, and it was very, very directed. We can march, we can protest, we can resist. Those things were very clear. I had a brother who was leaving. I had a sister in New York. And my brother, one of my brothers who was involved in the movement, were constantly being harassed by the police. They were being arrested. Matter of fact, the police could not separate, didn't know them apart. David and Marshall, the police would arrest them for vagrancy, all kinds of trumped up charges. They would be stopped at a stoplight. One time my brother was eating candy, and he said, okay, who do I have today, David or Marshall? And my parents was really exhausting their finances, getting them out of jail. And so my brother, by then he had graduated high school, and he had gone, he was trying to work there. He found a difficulty working. So he went on to New York. I had a sister in New York, so he went to live with her and he started working. And I knew I had that platform there. And I thought one of the ways of getting out, I got married it was a Navy base there. I got married at an early age, and I saw that as a way out. But I also knew I had a sister in New York. My husband, my youthful husband at the time was in New Jersey. So I spent time from New Jersey to New York. And I saw it as a way out because things had begun to happen. The churches were being, as I say, bombed. The family, even after they discovered the body of James Chaney, was murdered there, and he was buried there. The other two came back to New York, their home. They wouldn't allow them to have services in the same places. Their homes were bombed. They were leaving as well. It was an assault on them. Victims, family of the victims were being assaulted. So I thought the best thing for me to do was to get out as soon as I could. So it was kind of under duress that I didn't know exactly what was going to happen, and people were being picked on, and it didn't seem to stop for a while. When I first came to New York, I believe it took a back seat. I believe when I first came to New York, John Lindsley was the mayor of New York. And what I always made sure that I did, wherever I came, I registered to vote. No matter who was running, I always had my registration. I registered to vote. If I could do volunteer work in the campaign, which I did, wherever I was, I would do some volunteer work as a committee person, sometime officially and unofficially. It wasn't until I moved to Nassau County, which was in 1972, that I became a committee person, where I actually went around and with my, get names and things of that nature. And I always worked, most of the time, many times behind the scenes, in voter registration and registering people to vote. I've done programs for various leaders that are in leadership position now. I remember when Chuck Schumer was running, and I was doing fundraisers and things of that nature. I've always kind of done that, but I basically kind of took a back seat. Did it as just to support the efforts. I was however, in 1989, I was asked to run for or to take a seat as the first African American trustee in the incorporated village of Hempstead. And I think I made history becoming the first African American trustee for the village of Hempstead under former Mayor James Garner. And it was a bipartisan organization because I think practically everyone in his administration, they were Republican, and I was the only Democrat.
How long did you have that trustee seat?
I did it was an appointment because he became mayor. It was a little over a year. And I got to know many people on both sides of the coin, nonpartisan people. I got to know, and many Republicans loved me, and I loved them, and Democrats, and we worked together. And some of them said to me, they said, you're a Democrat, but I've never really been around that many Democrats, but I like you, okay. And I went to, at one point, under the president at the time was Senior George Bush. I had an invitation to the White House, and I went there, my first visit there, under that administration. And they found out that I was okay as a person, as a human being. And I think that's part of the problem, I think. There's so much division because people don't really know who people are. They don't get to know them. They have someone make this demarcation line and said, never the two shall meet. And you're robbing yourself of a very important education to get to know people. You can disagree on issues, but you can not be disagreeable, So I've had the experience to work with all kinds of people in all political fashions, and I think more of that should be done. I think people should just get to know people a little bit more and understand, open up those lines of communication. I had no illusions about how the conditions were. We were able to, my husband at the time, we were able to get a home. I knew that we were taken to certain homes, but sometimes we were taken to certain homes on certain borders. One time I was bordering Garden City. They said, well, but I don't think you would want this because the realtor would find things wrong. It was almost as though he had to bring me there, but he would find things wrong with certain ones. It was those kinds of messages I got, and I understood it very clearly. The community that I moved in when I first came here in 72 was an integrated community. It was an integrated community. There was changes was taking place. People were moving out. But it was about maybe 60-40, 50-50, 60-40 when I first moved there. It was on a dead-end street. It was a lovely community in Hempstead. I lived there for almost 20 years. But things had begun to change quite a bit before I moved out in 94, 95. There were other pieces. I know colleagues that worked in the real estate business, and they were able to share some of the pitfalls of, being multiple listing real estate agents. They would go and show homes, or if they were seen, many times the community would come and talk to the realtor and discourage that buy. They reached a point where they had to show their photographs, the realtor show their photographs, and that way somehow they could be eliminated from certain homes buying opportunities. That began to happen. I know people that were in the business. I know, of course, about the history of Levittown, after the war, and it was supposed to be for soldiers, opportunities for them to come and make homes. But my understanding is still pretty much the same that exists. There is racial steering. We are aware of that. All the reports from the Urban League reports, you can find current information. There's an organization out here called Erase that does a lot of work in housing discrimination in cases. There have been cases in the past few years. So it still exists, it happens. It appears to be that there's going to be something, always with us. It's more hidden in the North, but it does exist. I've never been delusioned over that. I would tell them that it was one of the most exciting, powerful, energized times of my life. There were pieces of it that I enjoyed immensely. The idea of so many people representing so many different coalitions working together for the same purpose, that's a good feeling. That's a very good feeling. And it made somehow the difficulties that we had to withstand easier, because you knew that everybody was working for the same thing, working for the good social justice or to correct social injustice for people. That's a good cause to work for. And I would tell them that if I had it to do again, I would do it again. And I would also tell them that I believe that each generation has a responsibility to fight for social changes, whether it be issues of gay rights, immigration, women's rights. There's so many issues, voter registration. There's so many issues that we have to be connected with. And the only thing that has made a difference is that coalitions working together to try to make changes. Change is not easy. And I think that because many of us are older now, younger people have to take on the banter. There is really no guarantee that things that you fought for is going to last forever. Case in point was the voting rights bill in 1965, and then to see what happened in 2013 with Holder versus the Supreme Court. In 2013, the Voting Rights Act changed. They took out parts of it, 4 and 5, the pre-clearance part that said that people no longer needed protection at the poll because that was Jim Crow, that was old, that people could go to the poll. And right after that was taken out, we saw massive voter suppression that took all kinds of forms in the place of having to have a voter ID, having convenient polling places to go to. It affected a lot students. It affected minorities. It affected older people. My father didn't have a license to drive at 99. He lived till he was 99. He was taken to the poll in Mississippi in '64 by Mickey Swarner and part of that group. And someone would ask a man like that, and it's been voting ever since, asked him for an ID, asking him for a driver's license. It's inhumane. So there are still issues. There's issues in social justice. There's issues in the criminal justice system. There's so many issues that one needs to fight for. And there are groups, there are organizations that are nonpartisan that are working right now today to try to make a difference in many of those causes. And so no one can really sit down and rest on any particular laurels. And I found out that, every 25 years, like the Voting Rights Act had to be re-voted on by Congress. I didn't realize when we were fighting for it back in the 60s that it had a shelf life. The right to vote should be a constitutional right, so there are things that need to be changed. And there's lots of work to be done. And the youth of today have the energy, the endurance to get out there and do it, and they need to continue. There's no resting place here.
Thank you for joining us for this program. And let us all remain committed to carrying on Dr. King's work and legacy by creating a more just society.